The tourist crossed the line and reached for the guard's hat, thinking he could get away with anything. But the soldier's reaction shocked the crowd and turned the day into his worst nightmare. The bright London sun lit up Buckingham Palace as the square buzzed with the usual throng of tourists. People chattered, snapped selfies, and pushed closer to the barriers, eager to capture every detail of the royal grandeur. Amid the chaos stood Guard Henry Fletcher, motionless and majestic. Tall, fit, and dressed in a perfectly pressed uniform, with his imposing bearskin hat, he embodied British discipline and honor. Henry was used to days like this. Tourists snapped photos, cracked jokes, and occasionally asked silly questions, but he always remained steadfast. His duty was to be a symbol, a reminder of the nation's traditions and glory. Yet even routine days had their challenges. Among the crowd, one particularly noisy group of American tourists stood out. Their leader, a tall, heavy-set man in his 40s wearing a gaudy t-shirt with bold letters reading, "London Rules," immediately drew attention. He laughed loudly, spoke even louder, and showed no shame in his behavior. To him, Henry wasn't a person but part of the attraction he'd come to London to see. "Hey, soldier boy, why so serious?" he shouted, tipping his soda bottle and spilling some onto the ground. "Come on, give us a smile. You're human, right?" Henry didn't flinch. He'd heard it all before. But today, the man seemed determined to go beyond just one comment. The crowd stirred. Some chuckled. Others glanced at the brash man with disapproval. Phones were raised higher. Everything that happened at the palace was prime content for social media. Seeing no reaction from Henry, the tourist smirked and stepped closer. His loud voice cut through the crowd's murmurs. "What if I make you laugh myself? Or maybe I should touch your hat to see if you react." He stretched out his hand toward Henry's bearskin hat. The crowd began murmuring louder. An older man with a cane frowned and muttered, "This is too much." But the tourist seemed to revel in the attention, unfazed by the disapproving stares. Henry remained silent, his gaze fixed in the distance. His training demanded composure, yet tension gripped his muscles. Every fiber of his being was ready to stop the hand if it dared to touch the uniform. "Watch this, everyone!" the tourist shouted, turning to his group. "I'm about to put on a real show. This soldier doesn't know who he's dealing with." The crowd gasped. Cameras flashed brighter, voices grew louder. Some laughed along with the tourist, while others whispered in condemnation. The air hung thick with anticipation. Henry, ever unshaken, stood tall, but it was clear the man's audacity was escalating, and the situation was far from over. The moment the tourist's sneakers crossed the white line, the air in the square seemed to grow heavier. The crowd fell silent. Phones were raised higher, and murmurs turned to tense quiet. This wasn't just a violation of a marked boundary. It was a blatant disregard for the unwritten rules of respect that the Royal Guard represented. Then, Henry moved. His actions were precise and deliberate, like the ticking of a clock. He stepped forward, every motion calculated to perfection. His voice, powerful and commanding, shattered the silence. "Step back behind the line, immediately!" The crowd gasped. Even those who had laughed at the tourist's antics moments before now felt a pang of discomfort. Henry's voice wasn't just a command. It was a reminder that rules were meant to be respected. For a moment, the tourist froze, startled by the sharpness of the order. But then, as if doubling down on his bravado, he smirked. To him, it was all part of his show. With a mix of arrogance and foolishness, he stepped closer to Henry and stretched his hand toward the bearskin hat. "What's the big deal? Let's see what happens if I touch it. After all, tourists pay for entertainment, right?" At that moment, one question ran through the minds of many onlookers. Does he even realize what he's doing? The answer was obvious. He didn't. Before the man's fingers could graze the hat's fur, everything changed in a fraction of a second. Henry's hands shot out, grabbing the tourist's wrist with precision and firmness. The movement was controlled yet swift, as if he had done this countless times before. "This is unacceptable. Respect the boundaries," Henry said firmly, locking eyes with the tourist. The tourist's bravado evaporated. His eyes, once glinting with cocky confidence, now looked dull and unsure. He stood there, stunned, clearly not expecting such a response. All he could manage was a weak mumble that was quickly drowned out by the crowd's reaction. What began as hushed whispers erupted into a wave of approval. "Well done, soldier!" someone shouted from the back. The tourist, realizing he had become the subject of ridicule, hastily stepped back behind the line. His face flushed red, and panic flickered in his eyes. What he'd hoped would be a moment of glory had turned into sheer humiliation. Henry adjusted his uniform and returned to his post, standing tall and looking ahead as if nothing had happened. But the crowd's applause and cheers lingered long after. For the tourists gathered there, one thing was now abundantly clear. They weren't just looking at a guard, they were witnessing a person who embodied the strength of tradition and the dignity of duty. The tourist, who just moments ago puffed out his chest like a triumphant victor, now looked as if he'd been caught in the middle of an unexpected storm. His face flushed crimson, and his once confident arms flailed awkwardly, unsure where to go. He forced a strained smile, hoping a poorly timed joke might salvage the situation. "Oh, okay, I was just joking. I didn't think it was that serious," he said, spreading his hands defensively. His voice was higher than usual, almost pleading. But no one laughed. The crowd, which had giggled at his earlier antics, now stood in silence. Disapproving stares bore into his back. Even his own friends, who had initially egged him on, avoided his gaze. One of them hastily switched their phone to video mode, clearly deciding it was safer to be a spectator than an accomplice to the embarrassment. A security officer stepped forward. A tall man in a sharp navy blue uniform, who had been silently observing with an expression as unmoving as stone, now walked toward the tourist with an eerie calmness. His voice, low and commanding, sliced through the tension. "Sir, you have violated the rules and disrespected a member of the Royal Guard. I must ask you to leave this area immediately." The crowd stirred. Someone murmured, "Serves him right." A few others nodded approvingly. The officer didn't need to shout. His tone carried enough weight to make even the boldest feel small. Okay," the tourist mumbled, stepping back. "I'm leaving. No problem." He glanced back at the crowd, searching for even one sympathetic face. But there were none. Even his friends feigned detachment. One suddenly seemed engrossed in the display of a nearby souvenir stand, while another studied the ground with exaggerated focus. The tourist threw his hands up in a final attempt to save face. "It's just a misunderstanding. I was only joking," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. The crowd, which had earlier been divided between amusement and disapproval, now acted as one. Applause broke out. A few even whistled. A young woman in the front row shouted, "That's how it's done! Respect other people's traditions!" The tourist's humiliation hit its peak. His face, now red from ear to ear, betrayed his desperation as he turned and quickly fled the palace grounds. The crowd erupted into laughter and clapping, but this time the applause wasn't for him. It was for the guard, Henry. "Good job, soldier! We've got your back!" someone shouted. Henry, as always, remained unshaken. Even after such an incident, he allowed neither a word nor a glance to disrupt his professionalism. With the subtlest motion, he adjusted his bearskin hat and resumed his post, standing as resolutely as if nothing had happened. An older man with a cane, who had earlier muttered his disapproval of the tourist, now looked around proudly and declared, "This is the kind of person we should respect. That man is a true pride of Britain." His words were met with a rumble of agreement, and someone even started chanting, "Guard! Guard!" Meanwhile, a new kind of activity took over the crowd. Phones were whipped out, and people eagerly reviewed their videos, quickly uploading them to social media. One of the first posts read, "Arrogant tourist gets what he deserves from the British Guard." Within hours, the video went viral, racking up thousands of likes and comments. The comments section was filled with emotion. "What professionalism! A true example for everyone. This tourist should be banned from entering Britain forever. Way to go, Henry. We're proud of guards like you." Henry, meanwhile, continued his duty. His face remained as focused and composed as ever. But those who observed him closely might have caught a faint, fleeting movement at the corners of his mouth. a slight, almost imperceptible smile. It lasted only a second, but it conveyed everything: pride, satisfaction, and perhaps a hint of gratitude for the crowd's support. In that moment, Henry realized his efforts weren't in vain. The traditions he protected still held meaning. Even in a world where cameras often mattered more than memories, and likes replaced genuine words, people could still recognize the grandeur of the authentic.